Chapter 14. The Cabin in the Woods. A young woman picked up the letters, Nancy told Ned. Mrs. Egan must have discovered our scheme and sent a messenger. She was lucky enough, or else she planned it that way, to have the letters called for when my friend was off duty. Maybe Mrs. Egan's back in town, Ned suggested. Yes, that's possible. The police were never able to trace her. According to word Dad received, she left the plane at one of the stops between here and Chicago. Ned whistled softly. Wow! If she's back here, she'll be in your hair, Nancy. She hasn't registered at the Claymore. I found that out. But that doesn't prove she isn't in River Heights. Ned, something's got to break in this case soon. We know that there are several people in the racket, and it may be that Brex is the mastermind behind everything. Blackwood Hall evidently had been used as headquarters until we got too interested for their comfort. All of the supernatural hocus-pocus was used not only to fleece gullible victims, but also to scare us off the scent. I feel that there will be a showdown within the next few days. Well, I want to be there when that happens, Nancy, said Ned. Later that day, Nancy called George and Bess and asked them to go with her to Blackwood Hall. The drive to the river road was uneventful. They parked their car some distance away, and all three trekked through the walnut woods in the direction of the historic mansion. But Nancy, what do you expect to find this time? Asked Bess. I realized when I was reviewing the case with Ned today that we never had checked those wheelbarrow tracks from Blackwood Hall. They may lead us to the spot where the gang is now making its headquarters. The old house looked completely abandoned as the girls approached. Suddenly, George cried, "The wheelbarrow tracks lead away from the house and right into the woods!" For some distance, the girls tramped on, stopping now and then to examine footprints where the ground was soft. Suddenly, in the flickering sunlight ahead, they caught sight of a cabin in a clearing among the trees. Approaching cautiously, they noted that all the windows were covered with black cloths on the inside. The wheelbarrow tracks led to what obviously was the back door. "That must be the place," Nancy whispered excitedly. "See? A road leads right up to the front door, just as Mrs. Putney told me." Bess began to back away, tugging at George's sleeve. "Let the troopers find out," she pleaded. Nancy and George moved stealthily forward without her. After circling and seeing no signs of life around the place, George boldly knocked several times on the front door. "Deserted," she observed. "We may as well leave." Nancy gazed curiously at the curving road which led from the cabin. Only a short stretch was visible before it lost itself in the walnut woods. "Let's follow the road," she proposed. "I'm curious to learn where it comes out." Bess, however, would have no part of the plan. She pointed out that already they were over a mile from Nancy's car. "And if we don't get back soon, it may be stolen, just as your father's was," she added. This remark persuaded Nancy reluctantly to give up her plan. The girls trudged back through the woods to the other road. The car was where they had left it. "I have an idea," Nancy declared as they started off. "Why don't we try to drive to the cabin?" Nancy was convinced that by following the main road, they might come to a side lane which would lead them to the cabin. Accordingly, they drove along the designated highway, carefully scrutinizing the sides for any private road whose entrance might have been camouflaged. "I see a side road!" Bess suddenly cried out. Nancy, who had noticed the narrow dirt road at the same instant, turned into it. "Wait!" George directed her. "Another one branches off just a few yards ahead on the highway we were following. That may be the one instead of this." Uncertain, Nancy stopped the car and idled the engine. Before the girls could decide which road to follow, an automobile sped past on the highway they had left only a moment before. Nancy and the others caught a fleeting glimpse of a heavily veiled woman at the wheel. On the rear seat, they thought they saw a reclining figure. The car turned into the next narrow road and then disappeared. Was that Mrs. Putney on the back seat? George asked, highly excited. I didn't get a good enough look to be sure, Nancy replied. I got the car license number, though. Let me write it down before I forget. Hurry, George urged, as Nancy wrote the numbers on a pad from her purse. We have to follow that car. But not too close, Nancy replied. We'd make them suspicious. The girls waited 3 minutes before backing out into the main highway and then turning into the adjacent road. Though the automobile ahead had disappeared, tire prints were plainly visible. The road twisted through a stretch of woodland. When finally the tire prints turned off into a heavily wooded, narrow lane, Nancy was sure they were not far from the cabin. She parked among some trees, and they went forward on foot. There it is, whispered Nancy, recognizing the chimney. Bess, I want you to take my car, drive to River Heights, and look up the name of the owner of the car we just saw. Here's the license number. After you've been to the Motor Vehicle Bureau, please phone Mrs. Putney's house. If she answers, we'll know it wasn't she we saw in the car. Then get hold of Dad or Ned and bring one of them here as fast as you can. We may need help. Got it straight? I guess so, Bess answered. Hurry back. No telling what may happen while you're away. The two watched as Nancy's car rounded a bend and was lost to view. Then Nancy and George walked swiftly through the woods toward the cabin. Approaching the building, Nancy and George were amazed to find that no car was parked on the road in front. How do you figure it? George whispered as the girls crouched behind bushes. We certainly saw tire marks leading into this road. Yes, but the car that passed may have gone on without stopping. Possibly the driver saw us and changed our plans. Wait here and watch the cabin while I check the tire marks out at the end of the road. All right, but hurry. If anything breaks here, I don't want to be alone. From the bushes, George saw Nancy hurry down the road and out of sight around a bend. For some time, everything was quiet. Suddenly, George's attention was drawn to a wisp of smoke from the wide stone chimney. There's someone in there, that's sure, she concluded. Somebody's lighted a fire. Overpowering curiosity urged George to find out what was going on inside the cabin. She could see nothing through the black draped windows. Trying to decide whether to wait for Nancy or to make some move on her own, she noticed smoke seeping through the cracks around the door. The place must be on fire, George exclaimed. When still no sound came from inside, she could stand the strain no longer. I'm going to break in, she decided. She flung herself against the locked door, but it scarcely budged. Looking about, she found a rock the size of a baseball. She let it fly at the window nearest the door. The glass splintered, and the stone carried with it the black curtain that had covered the window. With a stick, she poked out the jagged bits of glass that still clung to the pane. When the smoke had cleared, George stuck her head through the opening. The one-room interior was deserted, and there was no fire, not even in the big stone fireplace. A few wisps of smoke remained, but it did not smell like wood smoke. I didn't dream up that smoke, George thought, growing more uneasy all the time. But the door was locked, and I saw no one leave. Time dragged on, and still Nancy did not return. Finally, after an hour had elapsed, George, alarmed, tramped back to the road where they had taken leave of Bess. She was about to start for River Heights on foot when the convertible came into view around a bend. Bess pulled alongside. Do you know anything about Nancy? George asked quickly. Why, no. Her cousin related the strange story of the cabin and Nancy's disappearance. Bess, too, was greatly concerned. And I didn't bring anyone along either, she wailed. Mr. Drew was called out of town unexpectedly, and I couldn't find Ned. Just when we need them so desperately. Did you find the car owner's name? Yes, it belongs to Mrs. Putney. But what are we going to do about Nancy? I think Mr. Drew should be notified if we can possibly get word to him. Hannah may know where to reach him by telephone, said George. The girls made a hurried trip to the Drew home. The housekeeper told them that the lawyer had departed in great haste and was to send word later where he could be reached. "I really don't know what to do," Hannah Gruen said anxiously. "The Claymore Hotel has been trying to get in touch with Nancy, too. The chief clerk there wants to see her right away. We'd better notify the police. I dislike doing it, though, until we've tried everything else." No one had paid the slightest attention to Togo, who was lying on his own special rug in the living room. Now, as if understanding the housekeeper's remark, he began to whine. "What's the matter, old boy?" George asked, stooping to pat the dog. "Are you trying to tell us something about Nancy?" Togo gave 2 sharp yips. "Say, do you suppose Togo could pick up Nancy's trail and lead us to her?" George asked. "When she's around the neighborhood, he finds her in a flash," Hannah Gruen said. "Nancy can scarcely go a block without his running after her, if he can get loose." "Then why don't we give him the chance now?" Bess urged. "Maybe if you get something of Nancy's, a shoe perhaps, he might pick up the scent." "It's worth trying," the housekeeper said, starting for the stairway. She returned in a few moments with one of Nancy's tennis shoes and announced she was going along on the search. Taking the eager Togo with them, the group drove back to the spot where Nancy was going to investigate the tire marks. George dropped the shoe in the dust. "Go find Nancy, Togo," Bess urged. "Find her." Togo whined and sniffed at the shoe. Then, picking it up in his teeth, he ran down the road. "Oh, he thinks we're playing a game," Mrs. Gruen said in disappointment. "This isn't going to work." "No, Togo knows what he is doing," George insisted, for in a moment he was back. Dropping the shoe, the dog began to sniff the ground excitedly. Then he trotted across the road and into the woods, the others following. Reaching a big walnut tree, he circled it and began to bark. "But Nancy isn't here," quavered Bess. Suddenly, the little dog struck off for some underbrush and began barking excitedly. End of chapter 14.